The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Diane Johnson prepared for her day in court. She straightened her navy blue blazer and checked her reflection one last time. At 42, Diane carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years standing up for her community. Today was just a routine traffic ticket hearing, nothing she hadn't handled before. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she gathered her documents. As a community organizer in Westridge County, people looked up to her. She needed to set an example, even when dealing with something as minor as a disputed stop sign violation. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone steps already crowded with people despite the early hour. Diane checked her watch, still 30 minutes before her scheduled appearance. Perfect. She always made a point of arriving early, especially for court matters. Her grandmother had taught her that lesson years ago. In this world, you've got to be twice as prepared and twice as punctual. The security line stretched across the main lobby, moving at a snail's pace. Diane took her place behind an elderly couple, clutching her folder of neatly organized paperwork. The old courthouse didn't have enough staff or metal detectors to handle the morning rush efficiently. People shuffled forward one by one, emptying pockets and removing belts. "Move forward," a harsh voice called out. Diane looked up to see Officer Harmon, a stocky man with a permanent frown, waving impatiently at the line. When his eyes fell on Diane, his expression hardened. "I said move forward," he repeated, his voice noticeably sharper than when he'd addressed the elderly white couple ahead of her. Diane glanced down. There was still at least 4 feet between her and the couple. Moving forward wouldn't make the line go any faster. Still, she took a small step, not wanting any trouble. "Did you hear me?" Officer Harmon approached, his hand resting on his belt near his taser. "When I tell you to move, you move." The people around Diane grew quiet, their eyes carefully avoiding the scene. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the feeling that came whenever she was singled out for no apparent reason. "Sir, I'm in line like everyone else," Diane said calmly, maintaining eye contact. "There's no space to move forward yet." The elderly couple ahead looked back nervously, then shuffled a few more inches ahead, even though they weren't yet at the metal detector. "Don't talk back to me," Officer Harmon said, stepping closer. He towered over Diane, using his height to intimidate. "You people always think you can argue your way out of following simple instructions." A cold feeling washed over Diane. "You people?" The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. She'd heard that phrase too many times in her life not to recognize what it meant. "Officer," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I'm simply waiting my turn like everyone else in this line." "I don't understand why you're singling me out." Something dangerous flashed in Officer Harmon's eyes. Without warning, he grabbed Diane's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "That's it. Step out of line." Startled by the sudden contact, Diane jerked back instinctively. Her folder slipped from her grasp, sending papers fluttering across the polished floor of the courthouse lobby. "Look what you made me do," she said, bending down to gather her scattered documents. "Stand up." Officer Harmon barked, reaching for her again. By now, the entire security line had gone silent. From the corner of her eye, Diane noticed a young woman discreetly pulling out her phone, angling it to record the interaction. "I need to collect my papers," Diane explained, trying to keep panic from her voice. Years of community organizing had taught her how quickly situations like this could escalate. "These are important court documents." "You should have thought about that before causing a disturbance," Officer Harmon said loudly, as if performing for an audience. "Stand up now or I'll consider this resisting." Diane's heart hammered in her chest. She thought of her teenage son at home, of the conversations they'd had about how to behave around law enforcement. All the careful instructions she'd given him, be polite, don't make sudden movements, keep your hands visible, seemed to be failing her now. An older black security guard at the metal detector watched with a pained expression, but remained at his post. Their eyes met briefly, a world of unspoken understanding passing between them. "Officer Harmon," a woman's voice called from the front desk. "Is there a problem over there?" Harmon didn't turn around. "Just handling a disturbance, Ms. Rivera. Nothing to worry about." The court clerk, Ms. Rivera, frowned but didn't intervene further. Diane noticed how the officer's tone had immediately softened when addressing his colleague. With trembling hands, Diane finished gathering her papers, carefully tucking them back into her folder. She stood slowly, keeping her movements deliberate. "I have a court appearance in 20 minutes, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not trying to cause any problems. I'm just trying to get through security like everyone else." "Should have thought about that before you decided to be difficult," Officer Harmon said, but he stepped back slightly. The young woman's phone was still pointed in their direction, and other people in line had begun to murmur among themselves. The elderly couple who had been ahead of Diane finally passed through the metal detector. Officer Harmon pointed at Diane. "You, now." Taking a deep breath, Diane stepped forward and placed her belongings in the plastic bin. She walked through the metal detector without incident, collected her things, and tried to calm her racing heart. As she headed toward the elevator, she heard Officer Harmon call out to the next person in line, his voice suddenly professional and courteous. The contrast was so stark it made her pause mid-step. "You okay, honey?" a soft voice asked. Diane turned to see an older woman with kind eyes watching her with concern. "Yes, thank you," Diane replied automatically, though she wasn't okay at all. Her arm throbbed where Officer Harmon had grabbed her, and the public humiliation stung worse than the physical pain. The elevator arrived, and Diane stepped inside, pressing the button for the 3rd floor. As the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished metal, her carefully chosen professional outfit, her neat hairstyle, the folder of meticulously prepared documents. She had done everything right, followed every unwritten rule for how to be taken seriously, for how to be safe, and none of it had mattered. Inside the elevator, a white man in a business suit barely glanced at her. Diane straightened her blazer and composed herself. She couldn't show up to court looking shaken. She knew from experience that any sign of emotion would be used against her. When the elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor, Diane stepped out into the busy hallway. Courtroom 3C was already filling with people waiting for their cases to be called. She found a seat on a wooden bench outside and checked her papers one more time, making sure nothing was missing after the incident downstairs. Her phone buzzed with a text from her son. "Good luck today. Mom, love you." A lump formed in her throat. If only he had seen her just now, being manhandled in public like a criminal. What would that have done to him? To see his mother, the woman who taught neighborhood kids about their rights, who organized voter registration drives, who helped elderly neighbors fight unfair evictions, treated with such disrespect. Diane's hand still trembled slightly as she put away her phone. She took several deep breaths, using the meditation techniques she taught in her community workshops. "Breathe in strength, breathe out fear," she whispered to herself. A court officer appeared at the door of courtroom 3C, calling out names from a clipboard. When he reached Johnson Diane, she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and walked forward with her head held high. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy with tension and bureaucracy. Rows of wooden benches faced the judge's bench, which sat empty for now. Diane took a seat in the 2nd row, placing her folder neatly on her lap. To her dismay, she spotted Officer Harmon entering through a side door, taking up position near the bailiff. Their eyes met briefly across the room. The officer's expression remained cold and watchful, as if daring her to cause trouble. Diane looked away, focusing instead on organizing her thoughts for the hearing. It was just a traffic ticket. She had stopped at the stop sign despite what the ticketing officer had claimed. She had photos on her phone showing the poor visibility at that intersection. This should be straightforward. More people filtered into the courtroom, filling the benches around her. A young court clerk arranged papers at a desk below the judge's bench, occasionally calling out instructions to the waiting crowd. "All rise," the bailiff suddenly announced. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Winters presiding. Everyone stood as a stern-faced woman in black robes entered and took her seat at the bench. Judge Winters had a reputation for being tough but fair. Diane had researched her before coming today. "Be seated," the judge said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the docket before her. As Diane sat back down, she felt Officer Harmon's eyes boring into her from across the room. The confrontation at security had clearly not ended there. Something told her this routine court appearance was about to become anything but routine. Her arm still ached where he had grabbed her, and the memory of his words, "You people," echoed in her mind. But Diane Johnson squared her shoulders and fixed her eyes on the judge's bench. Whatever happened next, She would face it with the same dignity and strength she had shown her community for years. This was far from her first encounter with prejudice in uniform, and she doubted it would be her last. Judge Winters began calling cases in alphabetical order. Diane watched as people walked up to the podium one by one, their matters resolved in minutes. Some paid their fines with resigned sighs. Others pleaded their cases and received reduced penalties. The machinery of justice moved along at a brisk pace. Diane Johnson, the clerk finally called. Traffic violation, failure to stop at a stop sign. Diane stood clutching her folder of evidence. As she made her way to the podium, she felt Officer Harmon's gaze tracking her every move. The unease from their earlier encounter still sat heavy in her stomach. "Good morning, Your Honor," Diane said, her voice clear and steady despite her nerves. Judge Winters glanced up from her papers, her expression neutral. "Ms. Johnson, you're contesting a traffic violation from May 15th, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. I have evidence that I did come to a complete stop at the intersection of Maple and 4th, the judge nodded. "And Officer Peterson, who issued the citation, is present, Your Honor," called a voice from the side of the courtroom. A tall officer in uniform stepped forward. This wasn't Officer Harmon, but someone Diane hadn't seen before. "Officer Peterson, please approach," the judge instructed. As the ticketing officer joined Diane at the front of the courtroom, she couldn't help but notice how he kept a respectful distance from her, unlike Officer Harmon's intimidating closeness earlier. "Your Honor," Diane began, "I've brought photos showing the intersection where this occurred. The stop sign is partially obscured by an overgrown tree, but I did come to a complete stop. I've lived in that neighborhood for 15 years, and I'm well aware of that stop sign." As she reached into her folder to retrieve the photos, she heard heavy footsteps approaching from behind. "Your Honor," Officer Harmon's voice boomed from just behind her shoulder, making Diane flinch involuntarily. "I need to inform the court that this individual caused a disturbance at the security checkpoint this morning." Diane turned, stunned. Officer Harmon now stood uncomfortably close to her, his presence intimidating in the small space before the judge's bench. "Officer Harmon," Judge Winters frowned, "we're in the middle of hearing Ms. Johnson's traffic case. Is there a reason you're interrupting these proceedings?" "Yes, Your Honor, I believe it's relevant to the court's assessment of this individual's credibility." Officer Harmon's voice dripped, with barely concealed contempt. She was disruptive and uncooperative at the security checkpoint, refusing to follow basic instructions. Diane felt heat rising to her face. "That is absolutely not true, Your Honor. I was simply—" "You will wait your turn to speak," Officer Harmon snapped, turning toward her with such sudden aggression that Diane instinctively stepped back. "Officer," the judge warned, "Ms. Johnson has the floor right now." Ignoring the judge, Officer Harmon moved closer to Diane. "This is exactly the kind of disrespectful behavior I was talking about," he said, his voice rising. "These people think they're above the rules." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Diane noticed the court clerk, Ms. Rivera, watching with wide eyes. A few spectators had shifted forward in their seats. "Your Honor," Diane said, struggling to keep her voice level, "I respectfully disagree with Officer Harmon's characterization of what happened this morning. I was fully compliant at security. I simply asked why I was being singled out when—" "There you go again, playing the victim," Officer Harmon interrupted. His hand shot out suddenly, shoving Diane's shoulder with enough force to make her stumble backward. Her folder slipped from her hands for the second time that day, papers scattering across the floor of the courtroom. Gasps echoed through the room. The bailiff stepped forward, but too slowly. "Officer Harmon." Judge Winters slammed her gavel down. "That is enough." But Officer Harmon seemed to have crossed some internal line. His face had flushed dark red, and he loomed over Diane as she crouched to gather her papers. "See how she's creating a scene in your courtroom, Judge?" he said, gesturing wildly. "This is exactly what happened at security. Deliberate disruption." The ticketing officer, Peterson, had backed away, clearly wanting no part in what was unfolding. The bailiff finally reached Officer Harmon's side, placing a cautious hand on his arm. "Step back, Harmon," the bailiff said quietly. "Now." For a terrible moment, Diane thought Officer Harmon might shove the bailiff too. Instead, he jerked his arm free and took a single step back, his chest heaving with angry breaths. Judge Winters was on her feet now, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Officer Harmon, you will remove yourself from my courtroom immediately." Bailiff, escort him out and call for the court security supervisor. Your Honor, Officer Harmon protested. I was simply— Now! Judge Winters's voice cracked like a whip. The courtroom had gone deathly silent. Every eye was on Officer Harmon as the bailiff firmly guided him toward the door. Just before exiting, Harmon turned back to glare at Diane, who had managed to collect most of her scattered papers. If you hold me in contempt for this, I'll file a formal complaint, he said to the judge. She was the one causing trouble, not me. Officer Harmon, Judge Winters said, her voice now dangerously quiet, you have just physically assaulted someone in my courtroom. You're fortunate if contempt is all you face today. Leave now, or I will have you removed in handcuffs. After Officer Harmon finally exited, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Diane finished gathering her papers with trembling hands. A young woman in the gallery had slipped forward to help her with a few pages that had slid under the bench. Thank you, Diane whispered, accepting the papers. Judge Winters took a deep breath, composing herself before addressing the courtroom. I apologize for that disruption. This court does not tolerate such behavior from anyone, least of all from officers of the law who are sworn to protect and serve. She turned to Diane. Ms. Johnson, are you all right? Diane straightened her blazer and nodded, though her shoulder ached where Officer Harmon had shoved her. Yes, Your Honor, I'm fine. Would you like a brief recess before we continue with your case? No, Your Honor. I'd prefer to proceed. The last thing Diane wanted was more attention or special treatment. She just wanted her day in court to be over. Judge Winters nodded. Very well. Please continue with your evidence regarding the traffic citation. Diane took a steadying breath and opened her folder again. As I was saying, Your Honor, I have photographs showing that the stop sign at Maple and 4th is partially obscured by foliage. However, as a longtime resident of the neighborhood, I'm well aware of its presence and did come to a complete stop. She handed the photos to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. Judge Winters examined them carefully. Officer Peterson, she said, turning to the ticketing officer. Based on these photos, would you agree that visibility of the sign is compromised? Officer Peterson stepped forward, cleared his throat, and glanced at the photos. It does appear that way in these images, Your Honor. Although at the time I observed Ms. Johnson's vehicle, I believed she rolled through the stop without coming to a complete stop. Were there any other vehicles at the intersection at that time? Anything that might have obstructed your view? No, Your Honor. The intersection was clear. Judge Winters studied the photos again, then looked at Diane. Ms. Johnson, do you have any witnesses who can attest that you stopped at the sign? No, Your Honor. I was alone in my car and there weren't any pedestrians nearby that I recall. The judge nodded, considering. Given the evidence presented and the partial obstruction of the sign, I'm inclined to give Ms. Johnson the benefit of the doubt in this case. She turned to the ticketing officer. Officer Peterson, would you object to dismissing this citation? Officer Peterson glanced at Diane, then back at the judge. No objection, Your Honor. Very well. Case dismissed. Judge Winters made a notation in her file. Ms. Johnson, I would suggest you contact the city about trimming that tree to make the stop sign fully visible. We want all drivers to be safe at that intersection. I will. Your Honor, thank you. Relief washed over Diane, but it was tempered by the tension still lingering in the room after Officer Harmon's outburst. As Diane turned to leave the podium, the courtroom door opened. A well-dressed woman with an air of authority entered, followed by two uniformed officers Diane didn't recognize. The woman surveyed the courtroom, her gaze settling on Judge Winters. Your Honor, the court clerk said quietly, Ms. Reynolds from the district attorney's office is here. Judge Winters looked up, surprised. Ms. Reynolds, this is unexpected. The woman, Ms. Reynolds, approached the bench, her heels clicking purposefully on the hardwood floor. Your Honor, may I approach for a sidebar? Judge Winters nodded, gesturing for her to come forward. Diane wasn't sure if she should return to her seat or remain at the podium. Before she could decide, Ms. Reynolds glanced in her direction. Is that Diane Johnson? She asked, her voice carrying in the quiet courtroom. Yes, Judge Winters confirmed. We've just concluded her traffic case. Something passed between the two women, a look of recognition or understanding that Diane couldn't interpret. Ms. Reynolds approached the bench and leaned in close, speaking in hushed tones that didn't carry to the rest of the courtroom. Judge Winters' expression changed as she listened. her eyebrows rising in surprise. After a moment of whispered consultation, Judge Winters straightened and addressed the courtroom. "We're going to take a 15-minute recess. Court will resume at 11:45. She banged her gavel once and stood. "Ms. Johnson," she added, "please remain in the courtroom. Court security will be taking your statement regarding the incident with Officer Harmon." As Judge Winters exited through the door behind her bench, Ms. Reynolds approached Diane. "Ms. Johnson," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Catherine Reynolds, Chief of Staff for the District Attorney. I'd like to speak with you privately, if I may." Confused but curious, Diane nodded. "Of course." The courtroom had begun to empty for the recess, spectators filtering out to stretch their legs or check their phones. Ms. Reynolds guided Diane to a small conference room just off the main courtroom. "I apologize for what happened to you today," Ms. Reynolds said once they were alone. "It seems there's been a significant misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Diane repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That officer grabbed me at security and then shoved me in open court. What part of that is a misunderstanding?" Ms. Reynolds' expression was grave. "None of it. And Officer Harmon will be facing serious consequences for his actions. But there's something you should know." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. "The district attorney has been trying to reach you for several days. When your name appeared on today's docket, I was notified immediately." Diane frowned, puzzled. "The district attorney? Why would they be trying to reach me?" "Because, Ms. Johnson," Ms. Reynolds said, "you're not just any citizen who was mistreated today. You're a key witness in a case we've been building for months, and what just happened in that courtroom may have inadvertently blown the lid off something much bigger than a traffic ticket." Diane stared at Ms. Reynolds, trying to make sense of her words. "A key witness? I don't understand." "I haven't witnessed anything." Ms. Reynolds gestured for Diane to take a seat at the small conference table. The room was plain but private, with no windows and just a simple table with 4 chairs. A pitcher of water and some glasses sat in the center. "May I call you Diane?" Ms. Reynolds asked, pouring water for both of them. Diane nodded, still confused. "Diane, your community work has put you in contact with a lot of people over the years, correct? Including people from the Westridge Housing Project?" "Yes, I've been organizing there for almost a decade. We run voter registration drives, after-school programs, community gardens." Diane trailed off, uncertain where this was heading. Ms. Reynolds nodded. 2 months ago, you filed a complaint with the Housing Authority about maintenance issues in Building C. Specifically, you mentioned that several residents had reported gas leaks that weren't being properly addressed. Diane remembered it well. "That's right. The management company kept sending the same useless repairman who'd just put tape over the pipes and leave. Some residents were getting headaches from the fumes. I helped them document everything and file formal complaints." "What you didn't know," Ms. Reynolds said, leaning forward, "is that the management company, Horizon Properties, is owned by Gregory Wilson." "The city councilman?" Diane's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The very same. He's been using his position to secure city contracts for companies he secretly owns. The Housing Authority passed your complaints to us because they'd started to notice a pattern of neglect in all of Wilson's properties." Diane took a sip of water, her throat suddenly dry. "I still don't understand what this has to do with me or what happened in court today." Ms. Reynolds pulled out a tablet from her briefcase and tapped the screen a few times. "Your complaint included detailed testimonies from 12 different residents with photos, maintenance request copies, and a timeline of events." She turned the tablet to show Diane her own paperwork. "This is the most comprehensive documentation we've seen of Wilson's negligence. It's the cornerstone of our case against him." "I was just doing what needed to be done," Diane said, shaking her head. "Those families were being ignored." "Exactly. And that's why we've been trying to reach you. We need you to testify about these conditions in our case against Wilson." Ms. Reynolds set the tablet down. "But we've been doing it quietly. Wilson has friends throughout the local government, including in the police department." A chill ran down Diane's spine. "Are you saying Officer Harmon?" "I don't know yet," Ms. Reynolds admitted. "But the timing is suspicious. Your name appears on a traffic court docket, and suddenly an officer with no business in traffic court shows up and targets you specifically. We need to look into it." Diane's mind was racing. The community had whispered for years about corruption at City Hall, but she'd never imagined she'd be at the center of an investigation. "There's more," Ms. Reynolds continued. After your housing complaint, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division contacted our office. They've been building a case on discriminatory housing practices across the state, and they want to use Wilson's properties as an example. They've asked if you would consult with them based on your community organizing experience. Diane sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. The DOJ wants my help? They were impressed by your documentation and your history of advocacy. They've seen your work with the Tenant Rights Coalition and the Community Police Oversight Committee. You have a reputation, Diane. A light knock on the door interrupted them. One of the officers who had accompanied Ms. Reynolds poked his head in. Ms. Reynolds, Judge Winters is ready to resume court in 5 minutes. Thank you, Officer Chen. We'll be right there. She turned back to Diane. I know this is a lot to take in, but right now, we need to address what happened in that courtroom. Are you willing to give a formal statement about Officer Harmon's behavior? Diane nodded slowly. Yes, of course. But I have to ask, was I really just in the wrong place at the wrong time today, or was I targeted because of this Wilson investigation? Ms. Reynolds gathered her papers. That's what we intend to find out. Officer Harmon has had complaints before, but they've always mysteriously disappeared from his file. If he's connected to Wilson, this could break open the whole case. As they stood to leave, Diane felt a mix of emotions: fear, anger, determination. All I wanted was to fight a traffic ticket. Ms. Reynolds gave her a sympathetic smile. Sometimes the smallest stones cause the biggest ripples. They walked back into the courtroom, which had filled again during the recess. Diane noticed several new faces in official-looking suits sitting in the back row. The energy in the room had shifted. There was a tension, an anticipation that hadn't been there before. Judge Winters returned to the bench, her face serious. Court is back in session. She looked directly at Diane. Ms. Johnson, please approach the bench. Diane walked forward, feeling all eyes on her. Ms. Johnson, during our recess, I've been made aware of certain circumstances that put this morning's incident in a new light. I want to apologize to you personally for what transpired in my courtroom. Murmurs spread through the gallery. It wasn't every day a judge offered a public apology. Thank you, Your Honor, Diane said, surprised. I've also ordered the courthouse security footage to be preserved as evidence. The court will be filing a formal complaint against Officer Harmon for his conduct. The judge's voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. Ms. Reynolds has informed me that you're willing to provide a statement? Yes, Your Honor. Good. Court security will take your statement after we conclude here. Judge Winters looked around the courtroom. Now, as for the traffic citation that originally brought Ms. Johnson here, that matter has been dismissed. However, we have another issue to address. She nodded to someone at the back of the courtroom. A stern-looking man in a police captain's uniform stood up. Captain Taylor of Internal Affairs will be leading an immediate investigation into Officer Harmon's conduct and any potentially related matters. The judge's emphasis on related matters was subtle but clear to Diane, who now understood there might be connections to the Wilson case. Captain Taylor stepped forward. Your Honor, we've already begun our preliminary investigation. Officer Harmon has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Judge Winters nodded in approval. Ms. Johnson, do you have any questions for the court at this time? Diane thought for a moment. Your Honor, I'm concerned about potential retaliation. If Officer Harmon targeted me deliberately, there could be others involved. The judge's expression softened slightly, a valid concern. Captain Taylor, please ensure that Ms. Johnson is provided with appropriate protection until we determine whether this was an isolated incident. Already arranged, Your Honor, the captain replied. We'll have plainclothes officers monitoring Ms. Johnson's residence and workplace. Diane hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. The idea of being under police protection was both reassuring and unsettling. If there's nothing else, Judge Winters said, this court is adjourned until 2 p.m. She struck her gavel once. As people began to file out of the courtroom, Ms. Reynolds guided Diane to where Captain Taylor was waiting. Ms. Johnson, he said, extending his hand. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. So do I, Captain, Diane replied, shaking his hand. I've assigned 2 of my best officers to take your statement. They'll also brief you on the security precautions we're putting in place. He gestured to a side door. We have a more comfortable room where you can speak privately. As they walked, Diane noticed a familiar face, the young woman who had helped her pick up her papers earlier. The woman gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. In a larger conference room, two officers, a black woman and an Asian man, introduced themselves as Detectives Washington and Nguyen from Internal Affairs. "Ms. Johnson," Detective Washington began, "we'd like to go through everything that happened today, starting from when you first entered the courthouse." Diane nodded and began her account, describing Officer Harmon's aggressive behavior at security, his unnecessary roughness, and his disturbing comments. He specifically used the phrase, "you people." Detective Nguyen asked, taking notes. "Yes, several times," Diane confirmed, and his tone completely changed when he spoke to white visitors or his colleagues. Detective Washington nodded. "Unfortunately, this fits a pattern we've been tracking with Officer Harmon. There have been multiple complaints of similar behavior, but until now there's been insufficient evidence to take action." "What's different now?" Diane asked. "Video evidence, multiple witnesses, and most importantly, it happened in front of a judge," Detective Nguyen explained. "Plus, your background makes you a highly credible witness." "My background?" Detective Washington smiled slightly. "Ms. Johnson, we know about your work with the Community Police Oversight Committee. You've built a reputation for fairness and accuracy in documenting police interactions. Your reports have always been thorough and unbiased." Diane hadn't expected her community work to matter in this context. "I just believe in accountability." "Which is exactly what we need," Captain Taylor said, rejoining them. "Ms. Johnson, there's something else you should know. We've been investigating a group of officers who may be involved in covering up for certain influential individuals in the city." "Like Councilman Wilson?" Diane asked. The three officers exchanged surprised glances. "Ms. Reynolds briefed you," Captain Taylor said, understanding dawning on his face. "Just the basics," Diane confirmed. Captain Taylor sat down across from her. "Then you understand why what happened today might be more than just one officer's prejudice. We believe Officer Harmon may have recognized your name from a list of people Wilson considers problems." "A blacklist," Detective Washington clarified. "People who filed complaints or spoken out against Wilson's business interests." "So I was targeted," Diane said quietly. The confirmation sent a wave of anger through her, followed by determination. "What happens next?" "We continue our investigation," Captain Taylor said. "And you continue to be careful. The security measures aren't just a precaution. Wilson has powerful friends who won't be happy if his schemes are exposed." Detective Nguyen slid a business card across the table. "This has our direct numbers. Call any time, day or night, if you feel unsafe or notice anything suspicious." As they wrapped up the interview, Ms. Reynolds returned with another woman, tall, confident, with an official-looking badge clipped to her belt. "Diane, this is Special Agent Hernandez from the Department of Justice. She'd like to speak with you about the Civil Rights Division's investigation." Agent Hernandez extended her hand. "Ms. Johnson, your work has been on our radar for some time. What happened today only confirms what we've suspected. There's a coordinated effort to silence community advocates like yourself." Diane took a deep breath. What had started as a simple traffic court appearance had revealed a web of corruption that went far beyond one prejudiced officer. Her small act of standing up for herself had inadvertently shined a light on something much bigger. "I just wanted justice for my community," she said simply. Agent Hernandez nodded. "And now you might help bring justice to communities across the state. Sometimes the most powerful witnesses are those who never intended to testify." The following day, Diane sat in a large conference room at the district attorney's office. The walls were lined with corkboards covered in photos, documents, and red string connecting various points. At the center was a large picture of Councilman Gregory Wilson, smiling broadly at some charity event, his hand raised in a wave. "We've been building this case for 18 months, Assistant District Attorney Patel explained, gesturing to the boards. "Wilson has his fingers in everything. Housing contracts, waste management, even school supplies. Any city contract worth more than $100,000 somehow ends up going to one of his shell companies." Diane studied the complex web of connections. "And no one noticed?" "People noticed," Special Agent Hernandez said, entering the room with a tray of coffee cups. "They just couldn't prove it, or they were paid to look the other way." She handed Diane a cup. "We've interviewed dozens of city employees who had concerns, but the paper trail was always just messy enough to create reasonable doubt." Until your housing complaints, Ada Patel added. Your documentation was meticulous: dates, times, photos, witness statements. You even tracked which maintenance requests were ignored versus which ones received the quick fix treatment. Diane shrugged. I've learned from experience that if you want something fixed, you need to document everything. Years of being dismissed had taught her to come prepared. Ms. Reynolds joined them, carrying a thick folder. The security footage from the courthouse has been reviewed, she announced. It clearly shows Officer Harmon targeting you from the moment you entered the building. He bypassed 3 people ahead of you in line to single you out. Any connection to Wilson? Agent Hernandez asked. We're still digging, but we found something interesting. Ms. Reynolds pulled out a photograph and pinned it to the board. It showed Officer Harmon in plain clothes, shaking hands with Wilson at what looked like a private party. This was taken 6 months ago at a fundraiser for the Police Benevolent Association. Wilson was the keynote speaker. That doesn't prove they're working together, Diane noted, trying to remain objective despite her anger. No, but this might. Ms. Reynolds added another document to the board, a bank statement. Harmon has been receiving monthly deposits of $2,000 from a company called Blue Water Consulting. Care to guess who owns Blue Water? Wilson, Diane said, the pieces falling into place. Through his brother-in-law, Ada Patel confirmed. We've found similar payments to 3 other officers, all of whom have had complaints of harassment against community activists in Wilson's development zones. Diane felt a chill. So I wasn't just randomly targeted. Harmon knew exactly who I was. We believe so, Agent Hernandez said. Your name appears on a list we found in Wilson's office during our initial search. It was labeled Community Concerns. A hit list of troublemakers, Ms. Reynolds clarified, her voice tight with anger. Diane took a deep breath, processing this information. What happens now? Ada Patel sat across from her. We need your help to build the strongest possible case. Your housing complaint documentation is crucial, but we'd also like you to testify about the pattern of neglect you've witnessed in Wilson's properties. And we'd like your input on our civil rights investigation, Agent Hernandez added. The housing discrimination is part of a larger pattern we're seeing across multiple cities. Your experience organizing in these communities gives you insights our agents don't have. Diane nodded slowly. I'll help however I can. But I'm concerned about the people still living in those buildings. If Wilson realizes they're part of an investigation, what's to stop him from retaliating against them? The 3 officials exchanged glances. That's actually why we wanted to meet today, Ms. Reynolds said. We've been discussing protective measures not just for you but for the other residents who've come forward. Captain Taylor entered the room looking grim. We need to accelerate those measures. Wilson called an emergency meeting with the police commissioner this morning. We don't know what was discussed, but immediately afterward, 3 officers with connections to Wilson checked out riot gear from the equipment room. Are they planning something at the housing project? Diane asked, alarmed. We don't know, Captain Taylor admitted, but I've dispatched plainclothes officers to monitor the situation. I'm also concerned about your safety, Ms. Johnson. Officer Harmon was released on administrative leave last night and we can't locate him. Diane felt her stomach drop. He's missing. His apartment is empty and he's not answering his phone. His patrol partner claims not to know where he is, but they've been friends for years. I don't trust it. Agent Hernandez turned to Diane. We'd like to move you to a secure location until we can assess the threat level. Diane thought of her son. My boy is at his father's house this week. He's safe there, right? We've already arranged additional patrol cars in that neighborhood, Captain Taylor assured her. Your ex-husband has been briefed on the situation. You told Thomas about all this? Diane wasn't sure how she felt about that. Their relationship was cordial but distant. Only that there's been a threat related to your community work. He was very understanding. Diane could imagine Thomas's reaction, concern mixed with an I told you so about her always stirring up trouble. Still, he would keep their son safe. There's one more thing, Ada Patel said. Judge Winters has called an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. The courthouse security footage has been shown to a grand jury, and they've indicted Officer Harmon on assault charges. Diane raised her eyebrows in surprise. That was fast. Judge Winters pushed for it, Ms. Reynolds explained. She was furious about what happened in her courtroom. She's also authorized a deeper investigation into possible connections between the police department and Wilson's business interests. Captain Taylor checked his phone as it buzzed with a message. His expression darkened. We may have a situation. One of my officers just reported seeing Wilson meeting with the police union representative at a restaurant downtown. Officer Harmon's car is in the parking lot. The room grew tense. This was no longer just about one officer's prejudice or one councilman's corruption. It was becoming a larger confrontation between those who abused power and those who fought for accountability. I should get back to the housing project, Diane said, suddenly worried about the residents who had trusted her with their complaints. If there's going to be trouble, that's exactly what we can't let you do, Agent Hernandez interrupted firmly. You're a key witness now, Diane. We need to keep you safe. But those people trust me. I can't just disappear when they might be in danger. Ada Patel leaned forward. The best way to help them is to stay safe and help us build this case. We have people watching the housing project, so if anything happens, we'll respond immediately. Diane wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded reluctantly. She knew they were right about the bigger picture, even if it felt wrong to step back when her community might need her. We've prepared a safe house, Captain Taylor said. Detective Washington will escort you there. You'll have round-the-clock protection, and we've arranged for secure communications if you need to contact anyone. As if on cue, Detective Washington appeared at the door. Car's ready whenever you are, Ms. Johnson. I need to stop by my house first, Diane said. There are some things I'll need if I'm going to be away for a while. We've already sent officers to secure your home, Detective Washington explained. They'll accompany us while you pack. The reality of the situation was sinking in. What had started with a simple traffic ticket had cascaded into something that was now disrupting her entire life. How long will this last? Diane asked, looking around at the assembled officials. Hard to say, Ada Patel admitted. Grand jury proceedings against Wilson should begin next week. The evidence collection phase could take a month or more. A month? Diane hadn't expected to be away from home that long. We're hoping to move faster, Ms. Reynolds assured her. But these cases are complex and Wilson has resources. He'll fight every step of the way. As Diane gathered her things to leave, Agent Hernandez pulled her aside. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. The Civil Rights Division is considering using this case as the cornerstone of a much larger investigation into systemic discrimination in housing and policing. What you've documented could help communities across the country. Diane absorbed this information, feeling the weight of responsibility. I was just trying to get my neighbor's gas leaks fixed. Agent Hernandez smiled gently. That's often how the biggest changes start, with one person refusing to accept that broken things should stay broken. Detective Washington drove Diane home with 2 patrol cars following discreetly behind. As they pulled onto her street, Diane noticed something unusual. Her neighbors were outside, gathered in small groups watching their arrival. Mrs. Patterson, who rarely left her house due to arthritis, stood on her porch with Mr. Lee from across the street. Word travels fast, Detective Washington commented. As Diane stepped out of the car, Mrs. Patterson called out, We heard what happened at the courthouse, Diane. We're with you. Other neighbors nodded in agreement. Mr. Lee walked over, looking concerned. Someone came by asking questions about you earlier. Didn't say who they were with, but they didn't look official. Detective Washington immediately took notes. Can you describe this person? While Mr. Lee described the suspicious visitor, Diane's phone buzzed with messages. Word of the confrontation at the courthouse had spread through her community networks. Offers of support were pouring in from fellow organizers, church members, and residents from the housing project. Inside her house, 2 officers were already checking windows and doors. Detective Washington explained the security protocols while Diane packed a suitcase. We'll have someone watching your house at all times, the detective assured her, and we've set up a special number you can call that will connect directly to our team. As Diane folded clothes into her suitcase, she paused at a framed photo of her son. He was smiling widely, proudly holding up a science fair certificate. Fighting for a better community had always been about creating a world where he could thrive. Now that fight had put them both at risk. Detective Washington noticed her concern. We're watching out for your boy, too, she said softly. Captain Taylor has his best people on it. Thank you, Diane said, tucking the photo into her bag. As they prepared to leave, Diane took one last look around her home, wondering when she would return and what would have changed by then. The simple traffic court appearance that should have taken an hour had somehow transformed into a case that might reshape the city's power structures. Outside, more neighbors had gathered. Some held handmade signs, "Justice for Diane" and "Stand Against Corruption." News vans were beginning to arrive at the end of the street. "This is getting bigger than anyone expected," Detective Washington observed. Diane watched as a reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Ms. Johnson, can you comment on the allegations against Officer Harmon? Is it true you're a federal witness against Councilman Wilson?" Detective Washington stepped between them. "No comments at this time. Please respect Ms. Johnson's privacy." As they drove away, Diane caught a glimpse of her story playing on the television in Mrs. Patterson's window. The courthouse security footage was being shown. Officer Harmon aggressively grabbing her arm at the security checkpoint. What had been a private humiliation was now public evidence. Her personal experience had become a symbol of something larger, the daily indignities and injustices that went unaddressed until they couldn't be ignored any longer. At the next intersection, Detective Washington made a sudden turn. "Change of plans," she said, checking her rearview mirror. "We've got a car following us. We're taking the alternate route to the safe house." Diane looked back but saw only normal traffic. "Are you sure?" "Blue sedan, 2 cars back. It's been with us since we left your street." The detective's voice was calm but serious. "Standard procedure. We assume any tail is hostile until proven otherwise." As they took a series of quick turns to lose their follower, Diane realized that her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a community organizer fighting small battles for her neighbors. She had become something else, a witness, a symbol, perhaps even a target. But she had also become something more powerful, a voice that could no longer be silenced or ignored. 3 weeks later, Diane sat in the back of a government SUV, watching the courthouse come into view. The massive stone building looked different to her now. No longer an intimidating symbol of authority, but a place where truth could prevail if the right people fought hard enough. "Nervous?" Agent Hernandez asked from the seat beside her. "A little," Diane admitted. "It's not every day you testify against a city councilman and a police officer in the same hearing. Today's preliminary hearing would determine whether there was enough evidence to proceed with a full trial against both Councilman Wilson and Officer Harmon. The charges were extensive: corruption, bribery, civil rights violations, assault, and conspiracy. The past 3 weeks in protective custody had been both stressful and strangely productive. Diane had spent hours working with prosecutors, reviewing evidence, and preparing her testimony. In the evenings, she'd used secure video calls to check on her son and to remotely coordinate with other community organizers who were continuing her work. "Remember," Agent Hernandez said as they pulled up to a private entrance, "you're not alone in there. The evidence is strong, and Judge Winters is presiding." Diane nodded, drawing strength from that fact. Judge Winters had become an unexpected ally, pushing for expedited proceedings and denying every delay tactic Wilson's expensive lawyers had attempted. Security was tight as they entered through a service door. Armed marshals escorted them through empty corridors to a small preparation room near the courtroom. Ms. Reynolds was waiting, looking tired, but determined. "Good morning, Diane. How are you holding up?" "Ready to get this over with," Diane said, straightening her jacket. She had chosen her outfit carefully, professional but not flashy, dignified but approachable. The kind of clothing that said she belonged in that courtroom as much as anyone. "There's been a development," Ms. Reynolds said, her expression serious. "Officer Harmon has agreed to testify against Wilson in exchange for reduced charges." Diane's eyebrows shot up. "Really? After everything he's turning on Wilson?" "Self-preservation," Agent Hernandez commented. "Our investigators found offshore accounts with Harmon's name on them. He's facing serious financial crimes on top of the assault charges." "What does this mean for today?" Diane asked. "It strengthens our case considerably," Ms. Reynolds explained. "Harmon has provided details about Wilson's problem list and how officers were paid to intimidate people who complained about his properties." A court officer appeared at the door. "They're ready for you, Ms. Johnson." Diane took a deep breath and stood. As she walked toward the courtroom, she thought about how much had changed since she'd last walked these halls for a simple traffic ticket. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the back rows while the gallery was crowded with familiar faces. residents from the housing project, fellow community organizers, even Mrs. Patterson from next door. Diane felt a surge of emotion at this visible show of support. On the defense side sat Councilman Wilson in an expensive suit, flanked by 3 attorneys. He looked smaller somehow, less imposing than his campaign billboard suggested. Beside him, separated by another attorney, sat Officer Harmon in a dark blue suit instead of his uniform. He stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Judge Winters called the court to order. Today we are conducting a preliminary hearing in the case of the state versus Gregory Wilson and Michael Harmon. We will hear key testimony to determine if this case will proceed to trial. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking woman named Ms. Chen, approached the podium. Your Honor, the state calls Diane Johnson as our first witness. Diane walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, and took her seat. From this elevated position, she could see the entire courtroom. The supportive faces in the gallery, the tense expressions of the defendants, the attentive jurors. Ms. Johnson, Ms. Chen began, could you please tell the court about your work in the Westridge Housing Project? Diane spoke clearly and confidently, describing her years of community organizing, the systematic problems residents faced, and the detailed documentation she had compiled about maintenance, issues in buildings owned by Wilson's companies. And when did you first become aware that these properties were connected to Councilman Wilson? I discovered the connection while researching property records after repeated failures to get necessary repairs done, Diane explained. The ownership was hidden behind several shell companies, but public records showed they all traced back to Wilson or his family members. Ms. Chen displayed Diane's meticulous documentation on screens visible to the jury. And what happened when you submitted these complaints to the Housing Authority? Initially nothing, Diane said. Then some quick, superficial repairs were made, like putting tape over leaking gas pipes instead of properly fixing them. When I escalated the complaints, strange things started happening. What kind of strange things? Diane described the pattern of intimidation. Police cars parked outside community meetings, residents being stopped and questioned for no reason, her own car being ticketed repeatedly in areas where others weren't. Let's talk about what happened 3 weeks ago in traffic court, Ms. Chen prompted. As Diane recounted the events with Officer Harmon, the courtroom grew still. The security footage played on the screens, showing the unprovoked aggression at the checkpoint and later in the courtroom. Watching it again, Diane was struck by how clearly threatening Harmon's behavior appeared. Ms. Johnson, prior to that day, had you ever met or interacted with Officer Harmon? No, never, Diane confirmed. Yet he seemed to single you out. Why do you think that was? Wilson's attorney stood. Objection calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Winters ruled. Ms. Chen, rephrase your question. Ms. Chen nodded. Ms. Johnson, based on information you've learned during this investigation, what connection existed between Officer Harmon and Councilman Wilson? I've been shown documentation proving that Officer Harmon received regular payments from one of Wilson's companies. I've also seen the community concerns list from Wilson's office where my name appears, along with others who filed complaints about his properties. Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, whispering urgently to his attorney. After Diane finished her testimony, Officer Harmon was called to the stand. The change in his demeanor was striking. Gone was the aggressive confidence, replaced by nervous glances and slumped shoulders. Harmon confirmed everything Diane had said and more. He admitted to being paid to intimidate troublemakers on Wilson's list, described meetings where officers were instructed to target specific community organizers, and confessed that he had recognized Diane's name when it appeared on the court docket. And what were you instructed to do when you saw Ms. Johnson in court that day? Ms. Chen asked. Harmon looked down. Create a record of her being disruptive. Make her look unreliable. The idea was to discredit her before she could testify about the housing conditions. Who gave you these instructions? Councilman Wilson, Harmon said, not looking at his former benefactor. He said if I handled it right, there'd be a bonus in my next payment. Wilson's face had turned an angry red. His attorney frantically scribbled notes. By the time all witnesses had testified, it was late afternoon. Judge Winters took only 30 minutes to reach her decision. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented today, this court finds sufficient cause to proceed with a full trial against both defendants. Bail for Councilman Wilson is set at $5 million. Officer Harmon will remain released on his own recognizance as per his cooperation agreement. She looked directly at Diane. Ms. Johnson, this court commends your courage and diligence. Your community is fortunate to have such a dedicated advocate. As the court adjourned, reporters rushed to file their stories. Camera flashes lit up the steps outside as Diane emerged with her legal team. Ms. Johnson, how does it feel to take down a powerful city councilman? A reporter called out. Diane considered the question carefully. This isn't about taking anyone down. It's about lifting our community up, ensuring that everyone receives the safe housing, equal protection, and basic respect they deserve. Later that evening, at a small gathering of supporters at the community center, Diane finally allowed herself to relax. The housing project residents had organized a celebration, complete with home-cooked food and handmade thank you cards. Ms. Reynolds approached with a glass of sparkling water. Congratulations. Your testimony was perfect. What happens now? Diane asked. Wilson will likely try to make a deal, but with Harmon's testimony and all the financial evidence, he's looking at serious time. Ms. Reynolds smiled. More importantly, the city has already frozen all his assets, including his property management companies. The Housing Authority is appointing new management for all the affected buildings. Agent Hernandez joined them, her phone in hand. I just got word from Washington. The Civil Rights Division is expanding our investigation to 3 other cities with similar patterns of housing discrimination and police enforcement. Your case broke the dam, Diane. An elderly woman from the housing project approached shyly with a homemade card. Ms. Diane, they fixed our gas pipes yesterday. Real fixes, not just tape. And the repairman was respectful. He even took off his shoes before coming inside. This simple statement brought tears to Diane's eyes more than any of the legal victories. Real change affecting real lives. That was what all of this had been about. Captain Taylor arrived late, bringing news that made the room buzz with excitement. The police commissioner just announced a complete overhaul of the department's community engagement policies. They're establishing a civilian oversight board, and they want you to consult on its formation, Diane. Me? Diane was stunned. After everything that happened? Because of everything that happened, the captain corrected. Your experience shows exactly why we need this board. As the evening wound down, Diane stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The stars were bright above the community center where she had spent countless hours fighting small battles that had somehow led to this massive change. Her phone buzzed with a message from her son. Saw you on the news, Mom. You were amazing. Coming home tomorrow? She smiled and texted back. Yes, everything's going to be different now. Detective Washington joined her outside. Your protection detail ends tomorrow. How does it feel to get your normal life back? Diane looked out at the housing project, where lights shone from windows in buildings that were finally getting the attention they deserved. I don't think there's any going back to normal, she said thoughtfully. But maybe we're moving toward something better than normal. The detective nodded. That's the thing about standing up for what's right. You might start out just trying to fix one broken thing, but you end up changing the whole system. Diane thought about the unlikely chain of events, a contested traffic ticket, a prejudiced officer, and her own refusal to be silenced. That had led to this moment of transformation. I never expected to be at the center of something like this, she admitted. I was just doing what needed to be done. That's usually how the most important changes happen, Detective Washington said. Not from people seeking the spotlight, but from those who simply refuse to accept injustice as normal. As they walked back inside to the warmth and celebration, Diane realized that her special status, the one that had changed how she was treated in that courtroom weeks ago, had never been about her connections to important investigations. Her true power had always been in her persistent documentation, her community organizing, and her unwavering belief that systems could be made better if enough people demanded change. The next morning, as she packed her things at the safe house preparing to return home, Diane found the photo of her son she had brought with her. She looked at his smiling face and felt a new sense of hope. The world he would grow up in wasn't perfect. There would still be prejudice to fight, corruption to expose, and communities that needed advocates. But today that world was a little more just than it had been a month ago, and that, Diane thought as she headed home, was worth everything she had endured.